now really become a national and international organization dedicated to the promotion of exploration in the name of science and conservation. So discovering new knowledge and using it to protect the world around us. The chapters, which are all around the world, including in St. Louis, act to sort of like bring people together and affect local programs for networking, sharing information, sharing our love of exploration, and other programs as well, like supporting students, which we hope to be able to do soon here at the local chapter. I'm really happy that we have some student awardees of the national chapter here. Leslie, it's nice to see you. But I'm also really happy to be able to introduce Dr. Michael Frachetti, our speaker tonight. So Michael is one of our newest local fellows and recently a fellow national of Explorers Club. And I think, so both for Explorers Club internationally and for the local chapter here and local residents before we had a chapter, explorers have been the first to the lowest reaches of the ocean, the first to high mountaintops, the first to aeronautic and cosmonautic heights. But exploration is also more than that. So Michael's exploration has always inspired me because it delves into the past, sort of a little bit underground, but not deeply underground, but deeply into our past. And also because he uses really exciting new ways to understand the past, new technologies and new ways of using existing technologies. I think the first thing I heard about was maybe the sheet rain that you dropped onto mountains in Central Asia that allowed us to better understand exploration of herders establishing sites in the Middle Ages. So I'm really excited to hear about your work, and I'm so excited to welcome one of your colleagues here with us too. So welcome, Michael. Thank you.
I'm going to try to use this microphone because that way everyone can hear. If you can't hear or if it dies off, just throw something or raise your hand. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, everyone from the Explorers Club. And I'm even more excited in part because this is my first Explorers Club event ever, let alone here in St. Louis. And so it's a wonderful chance to see some familiar faces, looking around the room, some folks who I've known for a number of years, as well as some students who I get the benefit of seeing on a regular basis, and of course all of you. So thank you for being here. I want to point to my colleague in the front. You'll see his name here on the line just below mine, not for any intention other than the fact that he gets off the hook and doesn't have to talk tonight, at least too much. But Farhad Maksudov is a longstanding colleague of mine. We've worked together. We calculated 16 years or 15 years, something so far. And through that process, aside from just getting gray hair, we really have co-evolved in terms of our thinking and understanding of the world of Central Asian pastoralism, nomadism, and now urbanism. And so, we could give 7 different lectures between the two of us in terms of the work we've done together. But tonight you get to see some of the behind the scenes of work that is fairly fresh off the press. In other words, this is stuff that's not necessarily published. It's a little bit of it's published, but not all of it. And really, kind of what I want to do is kind of take you on an exploration of our own. So I hope you can bear with me. I'll try not to run too long. You may or may not have seen in late October or late fall last year, a flurry of press across the world in dozens of languages and dozens of outlets on this discovery. So this is the National Geographic cover story, but it ran in the BBC, it ran in the New York Times, it ran pretty much in every major magazine, newspaper, pretty much everything that anything that distributes text on the planet had a link to this for at least 3 or 4 days. It was exhausting, but it was an interesting kind of time because it was an interesting time for discovery and for exploration. Because what this article, I think the reason why communities around the world were interested in it is because it encapsulates very much what the ethos is of the Explorers Club, which is to bring unexpected and potentially difficult discoveries, difficult in the sense of how you discover them, and what is the way that you get something hidden to our eyes brought to light. And I'm looking at Aaron Addison and thinking of the work, him tunneling through caves and other kinds of things. And how do we bring those otherwise shadowed parts of the world to light, which is part of the title tonight, clouds of light, clouds of dust. In this case, it's a double or triple meaning, of course, because I'll be talking about point clouds, which are generated through lasers. So there's a bit of it more than just the metaphor of exposure. But the idea here is that that's what captivates, I think, so many community members around the world, aside from archaeologists and scientists within us. And so I want to walk you through some of that from a kind of narrative perspective, take you into some of the discoveries, show you some of the groundwork, pretty much just have a fun time thinking about archaeology and how we bring things to light through the process of exploration, but also through the scientific method. But let's start with something that is resoundingly unscientific. And that is the narrative of the Silk Road. Many of us know the Silk Road through different channels, or let's say different access points. The most common one, of course, is the fabled narratives of Marco Polo, brought to every child in a pool, but also, nevertheless, historically, debatable, but nevertheless interesting. The idea of a traveling merchant making their way across these extensive Asian markets and trade routes, caravans, etc., to the fabled court of Kublai Khan. To be, just the story couldn't be more amazing. In a different lecture, on a different day, I would tell you a story about how sheep were more important to the formation of global networks than Marco Polo certainly was. And I'll say a couple of words about that here in a second. I have a wonderful slide. I didn't include it for time's sake. But what's captivating about Marco Polo and the whole notion of a Silk Road that he traveled was that he was actually if in fact there was such a trip, he was very late in the game. He was not the pioneer explorer that anyone would have imagined. The Silk Road, by this time, 13th century, would have been millennia old, in the sense that the populations living in Asia, going back at least to the Bronze Age, so 5,000 years ago, had already forged the pathways of what we now understand to be East-West exchange between the Far East and the Mediterranean, and indeed points even further west. The classic picture of the Silk Road is something like this. And I like to call it nodes and roads, right? And many people ask, where was the Silk Road and how many roads were there? And this is, in my view, a very misguided way of thinking about the Silk Road, but nevertheless is how we're generally presented with it. A series of major urban centers, typically located in lowland, oasis, or riverine settings. These are the epicenters of trade and cosmopolitan interaction, connected by treacherous caravan routes spanning deserts and mountains and grasslands to bring wonderful exotica and commodities across the Asian landmass. That remains the story. In fact, if you pick up books published very, very recently, in fact, you'll get something of that nature. And I think that most of us, when we even go to the Silk Road countries today, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, China, where have you, we're presented with the idea of traveling the route of the Silk Road. And that typically is focused through the lens of cities. Right now, that's wonderful. I've done the same thing. I've taken people on tours of the Silk Road and done that exact thing. You don't just kind of wander out in the desert and say, well, we're here. You kind of go someplace. And that's because we are a place-oriented society. We think of ourselves through land tenure, and through urbanism, and through basically houses, right? We think of ourselves in those worlds. But if you ask nomadic populations how they conceptualize their world, it's very different. So this is a very quick glimpse into the story that Robbie was mentioning. About just under 10 years ago, I kind of had this revelation, and it was related to a photograph, which I'll show, that Farhad and I, well, a scene that Farhad and I saw, but which I happened to photograph that day, of sheep flowing down a mountainside, literally flowing as a herd, almost in like an orchestrated, movement. And they looked to me like a slow-moving lava of a sea of sheep, black and white sheep, moving through this draw, led by a couple of herdsmen. And I thought to myself, why can't we just model sheep like water? Why do we always think of transport as an end-to-end, point-to-point place, rather than we would think about flows of rivers? We don't think of flows of rivers as end-to-end. We think of them as crossing landscapes and meandering throughout those landscapes. So using fairly simple algorithms that are designed to model water, I just tweaked the algorithm a little bit. And this meant that we could trace, as you would trace water, the flows of sheep. In this case, not based on elevation and the way in which the water would trickle through crevasses and things, but rather sheep like grass. So you just flow the sheep across the best grass and you get these repeated patterns. And those patterns, when you aggregate them one on top of the next, create these kinds of dark red lines. These are sort of the dominant ways in which, if you were a sheep and you woke up in the morning on a spring morning and you had to make your way down slope by the fall, you would take one of those paths. Everything from the less frequent ones in yellow to the very, very heavy, deep ones in red. This is just through the process of computer modeling. That's interesting, but what's really more interesting is that when we zoom in and we look at the locations that are found on those red lines, over 75% of the known Silk Road sites to archaeology fall on those red lines. Now, the points were not used to generate the red lines. They are an independent check against this ecological position of how populations who don't worry about cities and houses and land tenure occupy a space and move through landscapes. And that's an interesting way of understanding the Silk Road, because if it did form 5,000 years ago, as I have argued many times, it didn't form by someone living in a city saying, how do we get to wherever, and then charting out in some engineered fashion, A to B. Rather, these were perennial, long-standing tracks of communication that herders and hunters and people who live in these places explored. They were explorers, and the Silk Road was the result of their explorations through these lands. So that's kind of the hook here for thinking about the Silk Road from a different perspective. When we zoom in particular, these maps have just a bunch of dots and numbers on them. I just kind of put it up there as a focal point. But what we can show is that a number of sites, and in this case, these ones. Oh, sorry, where are we? These ones here fall along what we can imagine as currently, like according to my model, more subsidiary routes. No less important, but not necessarily the most well-traveled ones. But things to necessarily consider. And when we zoom in even closer, I'm going to take you along some of those subsidiary routes to the sites where Farhad and I have been working for now the last 15 years or more, since 2011, so 14 years, I guess, with the idea of understanding how populations who see the world in the way I just described also defy some of our stereotypes about what cities and towns and places are. So it's a whole sort of ambit of paradoxes that I'm bringing you tonight as we relate mobility, pastoralism, and urbanism in this kind of like fluctuating set of relationships. But to back out a little bit before we get into those sites, I want to contextualize a bit about the social and political realm within which the sites in archaeology that I'll be describing existed. If we go back to the 6th and 7th century, this is only a few centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. We're in a time of great transition across Eurasia. China in this time period is, if I'm not mistaken, this is the rise of the Tang dynasty, right? So we've got all these amazing things happening east and west across the Eurasian continent, in part driven by millennia of exchange that helped to inspire these empires and large states to develop. In the middle of all this is a zone of contention. You have the rise of what is shown here in blue as nomadic cognates or nomadic confederacies. These are large tribal states derived not from land tenure and hierarchical ownership, but rather tribal relationships rooted in animal capital, literally stock, right? So you think about the stock market, you think about stock as a concept. This is the original stock. I mean, the way you make money if you're a nomadic population is trading and taking the dividends on stock. In this case, I give you 10 animals, you cultivate those animals, you have 5 new lambs, I take 2. Right? So there's my percentage cut of your stock dividends. This is exactly what was happening. And these populations generated enormous wealth and were able to capture the flows of commodities and items that were moving across Asia for many, many centuries and millennia. In red are more sedentary Persian state and city-state communities. These are more that classic civilization model that we imagine from the Middle East, right? Major urban centers oriented around agriculture with strong political hierarchies, dynasties and kings that could have, connected communities through hegemony and power. And these two worlds collided in the 6th and 7th century as these nomadic communities began to press into this territory of southern Central Asia. Interestingly enough, right in the middle of all of this collision are the sites that we're going to be discussing. And it's in that interface that I want to sort of contextualize the communities and the people who might have brought some of this political drama to life. One of the most clear, let's say, examples of the rise of early Silk Road urbanism, that sort of classic model of nodes and roads, is the site of Afrasiab. Afrasiab is the ancient name of Samarkand. So if you go to Samarkand today, you can walk across the remnants of this massive walled city. The walls are amazing, intact places. It's a really, really spectacular archaeological site. And within the context of the excavations, I think these were by the French, Farhan, they uncovered a wonderful palace in the main citadel of Afrasiab, of which the throne room, so to speak, was painted in elaborate wall paintings. Now, this is, of course, a black and white tracing of it. The wall paintings themselves are quite spectacular. I'm sorry, I should have thought to put the actual pretty picture up, but it's okay. But that one's hard to read. My focus here isn't on the beauty of the wall paintings, it's on the characters inside it. At the top is the ruler of Afrasiab, Vakhuman, who's ostensibly a Sogdian king. And around him in his court are a series of Turks. Turks we know because they have long hair, they're seated in robes, they're wearing swords. These are a retinue of warriors and viziers who had high status in the court of Sogdian city-states. But that's the historical narrative we've been told, that Turks basically were brought in as warriors, in some cases as warrior slaves. In other cases, they may have been given small kind of fiefdoms or little pieces of the pie to run their own sort of political scenarios. But they were not, in this context, the southern Central Asian context, they weren't running the power structure. They were subservient to the Sogdian city-states who were rooted in an agricultural surplus and all this amazing Silk Road trade. The Turkic archaeological sites, the ones that we know, the most, let's say, abundant archaeological finds of Turks, are largely burials, and that's in part a visibility issue. The burials that Turks used were not typically in cemeteries. They buried their bodies in these large mounds, oftentimes mounded with stone or earth, and inside those burials were elaborate rituals. So on the right-hand side, you see individuals stretched out in a long position, a sort of extended position, buried with an entire horse, with weaponry, decorated as warriors or as elite individuals. And these monuments are peppered all across the northern fringes of that blue zone, that northern half of the Eurasian continent. And many, far fewer of them are found in that interaction space, or indeed further south as you get into the sort of the Persian territories to the south. This will become important as I get down to the later stages of the archaeology. So please remember the format of these Turkic burials. As of roughly 2010, that's about kind of the extent of our knowledge of Turkic archaeology. There's a handful of artifacts and largely burial remains. That's kind of our understanding to a large extent. There's some exceptions, of course. When it comes to urbanism then, and we think about that map I showed earlier of these tracks crossing the mountainous areas of Central Asia, what we understood about urbanism was largely, again, related to this concept of Sogdian city-states. And those are the sites that you see in yellow at the bottom. These are built along rivers, along the shoulders of rivers, and even in cases where the elevation is going higher and higher, they nevertheless were largely taking advantage of a river, a riparian context, so able to sort of bring water off of a major river and irrigate fields. In the few cases that go up in elevation significantly, like the farthest one to the right in yellow, those were more like retreat fortresses. They weren't major cities, and they were quite small, something to the effect of 10 hectares, which, if I do my math correctly, I think 10 is like 17 acres, maybe, roughly. So 10 hectares is kind of the max size for most of these cities that are in elevation zones, and nevertheless, they still fall into this standard rubric of Sogdian city-states relying on agriculture and the displacement of agriculture from lowlands to highlands. The sites that we see in red are effectively all newly documented, with a couple of minor exceptions. The site of Mik was documented in the 1990s, and it was thought simply to be a fortress. I have some other thoughts about that, and if we have time, I'm happy to show you really one of the rarest videos of the site of Mik ever taken, because we actually, Farhad and I and a photographer from National Geographic, hiked our way up to the mountaintop there. I think we probably were the only people to visit, only archaeologists to visit that site in probably well over a decade, if not 20 years, because it's very hard to get to. And we had caught a window where we could bring drones into Uzbekistan, and we flew a whole number of drone flights over it. So we have wonderful footage of this amazing place, Highland Fortress. Again, fits into the story, but I probably won't have time to talk about it. The other sites is a small village site identified by one of our colleagues, not considered urban, and definitely small, within that range of 4 to 5 hectares. So basically just a handful of settlements. The two that I'm going to be talking about, they don't really roll off the tongue, but Tugunbulak and Tashbulak are two newly discovered sites. And it's not really the exciting narrative for tonight, because these cities are much different from what we understood before. And they present us with an interface between this sort of yellow seam of riverine cities with highland cities built on those highland ridges where those tracks that we traced actually flowed. So now we're putting cities right on top of those yellow and pink and red connection points and saying, okay, how do these potentially nomadic populations utilize urbanism in the context of this interface zone between two distinctively different economies and political systems? So here's the sites themselves. Kind of hard to encapsulate them in a single photograph. There's many more to come. The one on the top is the larger of the two. This is the one that got a lot of the press in part because of its size. And I'll take you through a detailed walk on that in a minute. I'm going to start with Tashbulak, the first of the two discoveries that we made. And again, this goes back to 2011 when Farhad and I and our teams were walking and exploring in the mountains of Uzbekistan in hopes of finding prehistoric nomadic campsites, little things that would have fit into the size of this room, kind of expecting that nomadic societies were mobile, transient, utilizing these networks of communication, but not necessarily like hunkering down and building major architectural centers. Tashbulak in and of itself is about 12 to 15 hectares, a little bit bigger than some of those other highland sites, but surprisingly unique in its position. I'll show a few more details of that here momentarily. Tugunbulak is a true unicorn as far as we can understand archaeologically, and I think that's really going to be that's really where we're going to end up. So let's talk a little bit about how we documented the city. Aside from walking over it and seeing it and saying, wow, this is bigger and different than what we've ever seen before, we immediately came back with funding from National Geographic to apply some technologies like ground penetrating radar that sees underneath the surface of the earth without us having to excavate vast amounts of dirt. This is a sequence of layers. These are like 10 to 20 centimeter layers of radar signal. And as you can see, as the layers kind of peel down, they go from kind of more diffuse to much more crystal clear imagery of these walls. And let's see if I can show them. So these are urban wall structures here. And then you have this central zone here. There's this large palace structure. Now let me clarify it for you a little bit. This is kind of the composite of it here. And if we spend time to digitize and trace it using our own bare hands, so to speak, this is kind of the upshot of it. It's actually quite a complex urban structure. So all of those little black lines and gray lines allowed us to pick up specific wall orientations in rooms, which we then went back and tested archaeologically with excavations. And I'll show you some images of that here coming up shortly. In this slide, there's an important nuance, and that is this thing called a necropolis. That was discovered using a different method. It's kind of a magnetic signal put into the ground. And here you see earthen burials, very different from the ones that we saw with the Turks. These are now linear cemetery burials, right? So just one after the other, without any stones. These are just earthen ditches, deep. And the reason why we're getting the signal is because when you make those ditches, you flip the soil over and you get reverse polarity, right? So the soil is giving you a different signal. We picked up one of the largest cemeteries ever found in these mountainous regions, and I'll say a couple little details about that as we go on further. But I just want to kind of point out that this structure is not so different, just at a different scale, from other cities. It's just the location and the spacing of it is really significantly different. And this image will show that here. So this is the position of the site. We're at 2,200 meters elevation. And for reference, that's like 7,000 feet or so. So at an absolute elevation number, it's not that high. But we're also at 40 degrees latitude, north latitude. When you're at 40 degrees north latitude, 2,000 meters is the equivalent of 4,000 meters in Tibet in terms of ecological stress. So the tree line is at 2,500 meters. So if we were in the equivalent location in Tibet, you would be at 4,500 meters. The only major difference is we get more oxygen. But the rest of the details, the sunlight, the intensity of UV, the rain season, all that kind of stuff is dictated by these elevation structures as they compare with latitude. And so this is actually quite an extreme environment given where we are in the globe. What you can see here on the foreground is a lot of the architectural remains of Tashbulak and some major features up on the ridgeline there and some of the low Pamir foothills behind. This environment is not an agricultural environment. There is no capacity to do farming in this space. The archaeology itself gives us quite a clear picture of the chronology. So these are a series of walls in the central citadel palace, that structure I pointed out to you in the middle. You can see a whole sequence, 300 years of occupation in this location, rebuilding and remodeling that singular castle and palace in the middle of the whole thing. And for comparison's sake, in spite of the overarchingly small scale of the city itself, the central citadel palace at Tashbulak isn't foundationally different in size than some of the other palaces like the one I showed you at Afrasiab. So the one at Afrasiab, the major capital in the lowlands, founded by or supported by huge amounts of agricultural productivity, etc., had a palace not so much smaller than that one at Tashbulak. Starts to flip our understanding of where power and money and how it played out. And in this case, specifically in the highlands, again, it's not necessarily about planting big fields, but it may be about having a much more extensive economy rooted in animals. Now, why would I say that these populations are nomadic when they live in a city? That seems kind of paradoxical and almost like wishful thinking. A lot of that comes from our understanding of the material culture. So the material culture found at Tashbulak in particular is this kind of handmade material that is atypical, very atypical of lowland sites. So if you go to those lowland cities, whether it's Afrasiab or indeed even those yellow dots along the Sogdian frontier, they're mostly making their ceramics on the potter's wheel. These are handmade ceramics, typical of nomadic populations and decorated in ways that are much more commiserate with a nomadic way of life. Here, for example, you see these slashy kind of splash painted ceramics. You see multi-vessel jugs, which are small and can be attached to horses and can be used for mobility. These are a very diagnostic type of ceramic called murgabi that are associated with nomadic populations for many, many, many centuries beyond even beyond this time period. And of course, we have a lot of figurines of both horses and other animals. So there's a huge kind of animistic quality to the way the materials are generated. This is just a small smattering of some of the materials. But again, you can see this one particular one in the front upper right-hand corner. Unfortunately, we couldn't find the head to make it really make sense. But once I show you the head, you'll understand what it is. I tried to pay my graduate students with beer to find the head. I was like, somebody's got to find it. We found multiple pieces of this one figurine, but we couldn't find the darn head. But if we had, it would have looked something like that. But this is a small horse figurine. Again, maybe a child's toy, but nevertheless illustrative of sort of some of the key players, both animal and human, in the world of Tashbulak. There are a few bits and pieces of more exotic or let's say high status ceramics, but very few. This is less than 1% of the total assemblage. And this is what you would find more regularly. In fact, if you go to the St. Louis Art Museum, you can see pieces that look like, I believe the next slide, yeah, you can see pieces that look like that in the St. Louis Art Museum. Right? These are Persianate productions. These are things that are coming out of that Persian world and being traded along the Silk Road into these valleys. So we can actually begin to document through material trades, albeit small percentages, that these communities in the mountains, the bulk of what they're eating with is just regular kind of tableware, and what they're using. And what they're producing in their own sort of cultural identity is the stuff that they like, that they use. 95 or more % is their stuff. But a little bit of it, they get some fancy things that they trade in and out of the marketplace. And that suggests to us that these communities aren't solely sort of just like, country bumpkins living up in the mountains, but rather are participating in this Silk Road process and engaging it in both economic and political ways. And indeed, we found some very truly spectacular items on the citadel. Here's a silver ring. So silver is a very high-end commodity here, inlaid with ancient glass. This is a really rare find and a clear museum piece. Finalizing our concepts about trade, We also have a wide array of coins. So we can actually document specifically who their trade partners were, because these coins come with geographic mints. So we know that the coins are circulating from distant markets going all the way out to Bukhara and other major nodes along that roads and nodes map, but indeed converging in these spaces that should ostensibly be fully left out of the broader economic system. Okay, that's Tashbulak. And frankly, if we had only ever found Tashbulak, we'd have enough work to do for a career. But of course, there's more. In 2015, we were working at Tashbulak with a large team, and one of the local forestry service agents came to visit us on the site. And he lives just a few kilometers away from Tashbulak. And he said, "Oh, ceramics, I see those in my garden all the time." And I said, "Where's your garden?" So we drive down to Tugunbulak, which is another, Bulak means spring. So in this case, Tashbulak means stone springs, and Tugunbulak means like a place where the springs are dammed, or like, reservoir. So Tugunbulak, we pull down into this steep ravine, and we see these massive towers, these huge archaeological remains, which to me are very evident. You see this pyramidical structure here, all this terracing, kind of Machu Picchu style, another major thing, and of course a wall. Okay. So we see this kind of coming down through this valley, and we're like, oh gosh, this alone is 5 times bigger than Tashbulak. It gets even worse. Of course, the site, as we walked around the site, we began to recognize that we couldn't appreciate the site just simply from the ground. Like you cannot actually, in any one direction, see the entirety of the place. We kind of first saw it in 2015. We scratched our heads and said, hey, what are we going to do? We came back to National Geographic and said, we found something really important. And they said, are there any golden masks? And I said, no, there's an entire city there. Like, no. We only wanted if there's a golden mask or something really fancy for our cover. So we went back, said, okay, we got to figure out how to deal with this place because it's so big. Long story short, by 2018, the government in Uzbekistan had changed. They opened up some of the rules about drones, and we were able to take this video. So we were able to go there, and I'm going to just have it rerun here for a second from the beginning. So we could actually see now the whole site. So the central mound is here, and you're looking down towards the others. So 1, 2, 3. So we're going to pan out, rise up. Here's those other fortifieds, the walls, right? More walls. You can see the vastness. Now this is that detail of that pyramidical structure, which we'll be excavating this summer. And you're going to pan across the entirety of this huge terraced ridgeline, about 30 or 40 hectares in total size. So 10 times the size of the largest neighboring city. Just that section alone. You see this huge fortified bastion here with a wall line, and it keeps going all the way across these terraces to the other mound where we started, and indeed beyond, changed angle, to these other features. The site end to end is more than 1.5 kilometers and about 800 to 1 kilometer in width. How do you approach such a site with archaeological tools? That was in 2018. In 2019, my daughters were born in June. The archaeological equivalent of this is the worst time you could ever have a child be born for an archaeologist, right? Like I'm always gone in June. So now I have to be home on June 18th every year. You realize the difficulty for me. Otherwise, I will have 2 beautiful daughters screaming at me that I missed their birthdays. Or I have to take them with me. So 2019, I didn't go to the field. 2020, I didn't go to the field because there was a global pandemic. 2021, I didn't go to the field because there was a global pandemic. In 2022, thankfully, we were able in that interim time to secure funding at WashU for a drone-based Lidar unit. These cost about $80,000, the one we had anyway. Now they're cheaper. Drone-based technology allows you to take this wonderful technological advancement of Lidar, which is essentially an airborne laser scanner, and fly over the surface at fairly low elevation, as opposed to high elevation from a plane, and create very, very dense point clouds that generate measurements of the surface. And because of the way we could do it with a drone, we were able to produce an extremely high resolution surface map. the kind of surface map that typically would only be available if you held the thing in your hand or used the terrestrial unit. So again, I'm going to call out our colleague Aaron. Aaron had been using these kinds of things. Aaron was the first to introduce me to the concept of LiDAR, frankly, using terrestrial units. But these are, and they're wonderful. They produce wonderful arrays of a room like this, and you can get very, very high precise things. But you can't take one of those units and put it on a drone. They're too heavy, they're too cumbersome. So to get that high resolution, we had to wait for the technology to catch up. So thank you to the pandemic, and thank you to my daughters, and thank you to the fact that we didn't know how to handle the site. So this is all exploration, right? Just waiting and figuring out how to approach the site that is too big to handle or to even fathom from the very basics of archaeology. So by 2022, we had the drone in hand. We got months and months of political struggles to get the permission to bring this massive thing into the country of Uzbekistan. We got up there, and this map here illustrates almost 200 hectares of LiDAR coverage at about 2 to 5 centimeter resolution. That means that all the points that are across this entire landscape, millions, and I think it's like over 700 million points or something, that detail every ripple on the surface of this landscape. That gives us a picture then of what is actually going on. And we did it at Tashbulak too. What this allows us to do is not only in areas where the architecture is more visible, like the ones we had seen from the car, right? We get a really, really clear picture. But also in areas where it's less clear, we're able to utilize the computer technologies and machine learning to actually extract some of the lines of the walls, because the microtopography is so nuanced. And when you have such high resolution, we can use a computer algorithm to trace every little corner on those surfaces. And that gives us the details of the rooms and the roads and the walls and everything in this particular area of the site. So here you see that central mound. We can count the rooms. That we know there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 rooms there, a larger wall. So we actually already have, in some ways, a base plan of what this thing's going to look like. I want to point out this one, because I'm going to show you details here in a second, of these columns of rooms with a central corridor with a wall around it, another one of these large structures. That's the second one we saw. That wall line that kind of continues around from that thing here, and many, many other features, but all these dense architectural features, terracing, all of this done without moving an ounce of dirt, essentially. We can also look at areas where we didn't even understand what was going on and see even more detail. So again, extending our capacity to illustrate the scale of the site in unprecedented ways. And just to kind of show you what they look like on the ground, some of them you can see, some of them you can't. For example, this area, you see this wall line here. When the light is just right, you can actually see the wall running counterintuitively up the slope. This, we think, is part of the surrounding walls of the overarching city, right? So here you can just begin to see this right angle. I mean, this is the kind of thing that nature doesn't make typically, right? So that whole thing, we're going to test it, but this is apparently something different. And just, of course, to go back to what we saw in terms of those towers, you can really see them now in 3D. Okay. So with any good LiDAR paper, you know, you always have somebody say, well, yeah, but what if it isn't there, right? What if it's just you're making it up? So in 2024, now armed with, you know, a major paper behind our belt and a real potential for doing something much more traditional in terms of archaeology, we decided to open up a very big trench right on top of that central mound, the one I showed you that had those columns of rooms in the corridor. And of course, lo and behold, what did we find? The exact thing that we saw in the LiDAR, these columns of rooms. And you can see again, for scalar purposes, kind of how big all this stuff really is. This is kind of what it looks like. And you have to kind of trust me here. I'll show you a few more details to demonstrate it. But these are essentially production workshops. So what we thought might have been a fortress turns out to be a factory, a fortified and monumental scale factory, producing, in this case, a repetitious production center for metallurgical output, iron, possibly steel. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, and I'll show in a moment here the details, these are the kiln pits, and inside those kiln pits are the remains of the iron. So if you reach inside there, you take out the big chunk of iron, it's like this thing the size of a pumpkin. It weighs, it's very heavy, and it's clearly iron. So we know that they're smelting iron in those things. So we're very clear evidential understanding of what's going on. And that's this sort of long channel of workshops, of kilns. So you see them on both sides of the rooms, and each room kind of repeats that pattern over and over and over again. This is a standardized industrial production. Okay, so that's an interesting fact. Let's put that in our column of things we now know. There's those slag bits that we found. That room that correlates with those kilns was covered, and it was buried. The floors were buried. And into those floors was dug this grave. Now, I want you to go back to the slide I showed you about Turkic burials. Here you see the individual extended in position, lots of weaponry along their body, with an entire horse body lying next to them. The only difference is this Turk is not buried in a large stone mound. They're buried in the floor of an iron production facility. That is a very important discovery, because not only is it one of the few Turkic burials ever found in Uzbekistan, I think it's one of 2 or 3 ever known in this southerly region, but it gives us an identification of what was going on. Now, there's a couple of different ways to explain this. On the one hand, you have warriors who come in and destroy the city and someone dies. But this is not that kind of a burial. This isn't somebody who was shot in the back of the head, or who was running away from a battle. This is a ritual burial of an elite individual with a horse and all the other things. This is a person who was associated with that room in the way in which you would inter a person of prestige and value. And so I believe, and the chronology backs this, that this is the closure of this factory with the implantation of it, or the interment of a elite guard, so to speak. This is an individual living amongst the population that operated the actual factory in and of itself for upwards of 100 years. So this is the last stage of that operation. And the detail is amazing. This individual had earrings. They had a bark bag full of coins. The archaeology is amazing, and we're still working on the restoration, or else I can't get, otherwise I'll give you much cleaner details. But here's some of the artifacts from the surrounding site. This site has a variety of features that correlate with Tashbulak to a certain extent. We have the same kind of handmade ceramics. We have ceramics with Turkic runes, so language. So this is written Turkic script etched into the bottom of the ceramic, so it may be commissioned or written at the time of production. We have a few bits and pieces of those trade wares. We have beautiful beads made of a variety of imported materials that are not local. We've got copper pots. We've got steel and iron weaponry. So this is that wonderful arrowhead, a bit corroded. Yeah, again, restoration will show it to be a bit cleaner. Interestingly enough, it has a whistler on it. This is like this little wooden knob that goes at the bottom. So when they fire this big battle arrow, it goes kind of a neat little detail. They're hard to find. Across the array of material that we have, we think we have a whole spectrum of trade and objects that illustrate to us the identity of the communities that actually built this city. And they weren't lowland Sogdians. They were highland, high-altitude nomadic Turks. The icing on the cake is this coin. So the coin in the middle was found at Tugunbulak, perhaps the only one of these coins ever found in situ, meaning at a local place that we can say this is the place where it was found. The other ones were all in coin hoards, so collections of coins buried in some random place in a garden. Okay. Numismatists who study these types of coins with these faces. Now go back to the panel at Afrasiab. Long hair, right? Asiatic features, right? And on the back of the coin is a symbol called a tamga. The tamga is a tribal symbol, right? This is not a royal symbol. This is a tribal symbol applied to the entire membership of the tribe. These tamgas are a very specific type of coin, only found in the circle that I showed you there. And ours, the only one found in an actual location, a massive city located at a high altitude location, is in the middle of the circle. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it could very well be that we actually have the place where this political entity, this Turkic mint, as it were, could actually be functioning out of Tugunbulak as this major urban center oriented around these Turks who, by every definition, should not be building cities and should not be major players. They should be slaves and military and soldiers in the armies of lowland city-states. But it doesn't seem to be the case. Chronologically, these sites fit perfectly within the rise of these khaganates that I talked about. So the earliest dates are about 560, literally to the date historically when the first Turkic Empire comes to power in Kazakhstan, 1,000 kilometers to the north. So it would suggest that these Turkic communities were much more pervasive and much more networked across Eurasia at this time than ever imagined, if in fact we can associate those early layers with those same populations. And then you see this consistent set of radiocarbon dates. This is something like 30 or some odd radiocarbon dates running straight through to the 9th century. The early 10th century. And what we can see here is different phases. And of course, the burial that I was talking about sits right here. So again, you have about 100 years of this factory running, apparently. It's the upper bound and lower bound of the actual production center. And then a seal, the body goes in without any major continuity, without any major discontinuity. And then a revitalization of the site. And this other little graph over here illustrates the later occupations in the lower parts of the city. We did some testing there too. So we know that the city extends up until the 11th century, but this major central feature only goes up to the 9th or end of the 10th. So the transition is a smooth one, not an abrupt one. It's not a collapse. It's just a transition towards a change, and something happens at that time period around the beginning of the 8th century. So again, going back to our original picture, situating Tugunbulak and Tashbulak in this chaotic political sphere, we now have to begin to question, is what we understand from historical perspectives accurate? Is it simply that nomads were antagonistic to urban centers in the south? Is it that there was this kind of pejorative relationship, or hegemonic relationship, between urban city-states dominated by agricultural production and nomadic peripheries considered to be uncivilized and wild and barbaric? Or can we see a role for nomadic populations that changes our paradoxical view of these two communities and rather situates Turks as productive members of a broader economic system of the Silk Road from the earliest moment of their political arrangement? This is a question for us to continue to consider. But as we see the changing geography throughout the centuries, we see that in fact this interplay of lowland agriculture and grassland or mountain nomadism becomes a trope. It becomes a point of historical contention, maybe less than it actually was. So in other words, overstated in the historical record and far less in the actual record than what we would expect. The final mystery that I will leave you with tonight, is that of the city of Marsmanda. So many people say, well, what was the city called? Were there any historical records that talk about this place? Or what was the nature of the city and who ran it, and et cetera? So we think it was run by Turks. We have a mounting amount of evidence. We'll continue to work on this line of thinking and make hopefully more discoveries on that front. But there is a reference in the 10th century Arab sources about a city located high in the mountains in the region of Mik, the site that I told you about that we did the video on. So this is a historically named city, is the city of Marsmanda, which they're known for making steel instruments, again, iron and steel, which are sold across Khorasan, which is basically like Iraq, and are in high demand. Sorry, Khorasan is like Iran, and in high demand in Iraq. The quote goes on to say, in the wintertime, the rivers freeze. There's no opportunity to grow trees or to grow fruits, so they have to be at a certain elevation. Robbie, I have added that in there for you. So there's a botanical element. There's always references that say, where is this place? We can't prove that this is Marsmanda yet. We need to have something that says Marsmanda. Okay, so we're working on that, right? We'll see what we can find. We need to have that canon that says Marsmanda. But we do think that we have a pretty strong argument for it. And if it is the case, this will be one of the great lost cities of the Arab historical texts, and indeed a major discovery just by and large. So how are we going to do it? Well, we have a 10-year scientific program. We've launched the program last year, so we expect to finish. I think my kids will just be going off to college, and then I can retire. Point being that we are doing a heavy scientific approach, paleobotany, paleohydrology, ceramics, petrography, a whole number of scientific approaches to sort of understand what does the archaeology tell us, metallurgical analysis, isotopic analysis, zooarchaeology. So we're kind of now casting our net very widely to try to understand what kind of details can we squeeze out of the archaeology that we're excavating, and also using these other methods like geophysics to understand the larger space, because we're only punching very small holes into the surface, right? Little pinholes archaeologically. And so you can see the kind of small little details that we pull out from these tiny excavations. It's not really enough. We need to have this mega program. So in the next 10 years, we'll continue to open up these windows. And when we get a gold mask, I'm going to send a nasty email to National Geographic. But 2025 is a planned excavation of the big tower. And this is very exciting because who knows what's there. It could be an armory, in which case it could be filled with amazing steel swords. It could be full of grains. It could be full of bodies. It's something big, and it's like the main pyramid, right? So we're going to dig the main pyramid this summer and hopefully come back with some even greater tales. So with that, I want to just say one last thing, and it's the most critical thing. I've already thanked Farhad, but I want to thank broadly the entirety of the team, both local, meaning Uzbek, and international. You know, I get the good fortune of being the narrator and the storyteller for this project in a lot of ways, and I love that. I love that role. It's one that I'm potentially uniquely built for, because I'm very bad at science. But the team that we're building is fantastic, and that's really going to be, you know, drawing those communities together to intersect the knowledge that we find through scientific methods, but also through that process of local engagement, community engagement. These are all key elements to our project, and none of it can exist without them, and of course, without our generous foundational sponsors. So with that, I'll say thank you and happy to take questions.